what now can we do, the ministry of reconciliation. So the question is on race and some of the comments today and what can we do with regard to reconciliation. And reconciliation applies mutuality. It applies dignity, solidarity, understanding. And so the biggest problem with race in America today is that we're not understanding each other fully. And I think there's a greater need for us to understand each other's stories and experience so that we respond as informed people. If I don't understand where my African American brother or sister is coming from, then I guarantee you my best intentions at unity are going to either be flat or on one end, or on the other end, downright offensive, right? So this is what we do at Kilns College. We try to educate. We talk about some of the myths that we have out there. I grew up and the first thing I heard about Martin Luther King Jr., and I'm talking from teachers, from just everywhere I went, for my whole upbringing, my view of Martin Luther King Jr. was that he was a philanderer. That's what I got. Did anyone else get that in the culture you grew up in? Yeah. Okay. It's the J. Edgar Hoover narrative, right? That's not the narrative that African American young women and men got. He was a hero. Why do we not hear about the exploits of Jefferson or Kennedy or any number of white presidential leaders or figures? We hear about their political achievements or the great things they did. But somehow growing up as a white man, I was always getting the character assassination version of Martin Luther King Jr. It's really, really weird. So that has to be addressed. It has to be challenged, right? Otherwise, we have people walking around with strange things that they don't even know are strange, right? There are a lot of people out there that think the reason poor communities in America are poor is because those people don't work hard enough. I grew up with that one. My dad was an immigrant, and he worked hard. And so he advanced himself, and by the time I was in college, he was able to pay for my college education, blah, 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 blah. Well, certainly my dad worked hard, but there's another thing going on there. That if you took my dad as a white immigrant, and you took an immigrant that came the exact same year, exact same age as a person of color, the systems and the structures advantaged my dad's advancement. Not only that, but there's this thing that very few white people I know even have a clue of, but the Federal Housing Administration, up until the 90s, had this thing called red line districts. And they didn't want to, in red line districts, give the same kind of loans into that because basically it wasn't a good loan because those are impoverished communities. Well, those communities were largely all African American communities that were redlined, okay? Meaning they don't get the same kind of economic opportunity from the federal government as non-redlined communities. Well, why were all the African Americans living together? Well, because after World War II, when all the suburban things started, neighborhoods actually forbade African Americans from moving into those neighborhoods. So you can have an African American who works really hard, but his house over the course of 20, 30 years stays at the exact same value. It doesn't appreciate, right? And his job doesn't pay as much. Why? Because he works in the neighborhood, and the jobs in those neighborhoods cater to a neighborhood that doesn't have a lot of resources, so your jobs are even going to bring home less wages, right? So while my dad was buying a house in the military, 3 years later selling the house, and then taking what was the word I just used? Appreciation. Taking the appreciation. Buying a new house, 3 years later, selling the house, taking the appreciation. By the reason my dad was able to accumulate wealth, and most of the white middle class or upper middle class families, I'm talking generations here, the reason most of those families have been able to accumulate wealth has largely been through real estate and the appreciation that comes in the housing market when you own your own home. Not just, we all spend our paychecks. It's the appreciation of houses that really builds generational wealth. And my dad, by buying and selling and buying and selling and buying and selling, was able to accumulate wealth. The same person working very hard in a red-lined housing district because of the systems and structures that disadvantage them because of the color of their skin, and ultimately because their neighborhood was colored, over the course of 30, 40 years, is not able to generate the same kind of wealth. So that myth of, well, these people work hard and these people don't, is a myth. There are other factors at play. Now, it doesn't mean that every single individual in these communities works hard. There's plenty that don't. And it doesn't mean that every single person with wealth works hard. I know plenty of wealthy people that don't. But we have to begin to, when you're asking about what can we do to begin to move toward reconciliation, we have to challenge the myths of race and color that keep us on other sides of a line not understanding each other. We have to begin to build mutual understanding so that we can appreciate the narrative, the story, the context that someone else has grown up in. I'll give one last example, and we'll call it good. This is very political, but it's not meant to be. I'm an independent. I pick on Democrats and Republicans equally. But the reason early on, there's, opening a can of worms. The election in '64 between Johnson and Goldwater was a real tipping point. And you had 4 southern states vote for a Republican candidate that had never voted for a Republican candidate ever. The Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. Why would a southern state vote for the Republican Party? But in that '64 election, they did. Why? Because Johnson brought the civil rights legislation, and Goldwater, as a senator, had actually voted against it. So those racist states voted against the Democrats and for the Republican candidate in that election. Okay? It's the first time it ever happened. What do the southern states vote now? Almost entirely Republican. How did that happen? Well, beginning in '64, because of the way that went, the Democrats, Martin Luther King Jr. was encouraging people, you can register to vote now. There's all this legislation, register to vote. By the way, this party is friendly to us. And so that began to happen. So in the early '70s, the conversation is, look at all these African Americans registering to vote Democrat. So in 1972, Kevin Phillips, the Karl Rove of his day, gave an interview in the New York Times, you can look it up, and he says there's this thing called the Southern Strategy, where we're looking at it and saying if we tried to go compete with those African American votes, it would be short-sighted. We've lost that one. We're never going to get more than 20% of the African American vote now that it's kind of gone this way, but that's not a problem, because actually the more African Americans the Democrats get to register for their party, the sooner the white Southerners will come over to the Republican side, and that's where the power is. And if we don't continue to have this race thing going on, they're going to probably go back to their old comfortable relationship with the Southern Democrat. And we don't want that. We want them to come to our party. Well, that doesn't mean if you're a Republican today, you're racist. Not at all. Okay? But what it means is your African American friend that's a Democrat and votes Democrat understands probably more than you do a story of civil rights and civil rights legislation and race and how that has played into party politics, and is aware of all of that. And when you come to them and say, I think free market should be this way and this and that and the other, and you've got it wrong, that you're only focusing on a couple platform issues and missing a much bigger part of the story that they're intimately acquainted with. And if you don't try to understand that and look at it and even just go, dang, that's really bad. It doesn't mean that I have to change my party affiliation or the way I see politics, but I gotta call evil evil. And I gotta confess the skeletons in the closet. And I gotta be willing to understand these things so that now we can have a conversation as equals who understand each other, who care about each other, who value each other. So again, it's challenging the myths, trying to educate, trying to create a platform for dialogue, because all relationship requires dialogue, and all dialogue requires equal footing. And so that's how it's going to happen, to the degree it's going to happen.